Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 12 of Business Therapy. My name is Sam, and as always, I'm here with Jonathan. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on all our weekly topics and discussions about everything Trueble. Today, I'd like to continue our conversation about standards as a prerequisite to some of the cooler things that we're looking for in life, like digitization, automation, cost reduction. I mean, really, it's kind of, in my opinion, the base of a lot of good things. And for those of you who are just catching up with us, we had a rousing discussion, or one might say a circuitous discussion last week about the standard definition, what it is, why it's a project, why it's a solution. So if you're a little lost on this one, it might be worth checking us out on episode 11. But this week we really want to talk more about how people skip this step of building standards and why it's so important to get alignment and have a standard in place before you try to do any of the more complicated things, like I mentioned, moving over to systems, moving to automated solutions. And I know, Jonathan, you have a lot of experience with this one across various business contexts.
So we're speaking about it in the business process context. Standards is in terms of business process. Do you think it pays to give some history on how it's played out in the business process context?
I think it always pays to give history. It gives people an expanded vision. So why don't you lay it on us?
So, and I know this is an area that you've done quite a bit of learning on, but I would say it starts with the Model T in terms of the business process. And I would say that's more about output, focusing on, I guess the quote was, you can have any color as long as it's black, and having a standard in that regard.
And this is the Ford Model T he's talking about, the
Ford Model T.
Ford Motor Company, for those of you who are maybe not as familiar. Cars, we're making cars here.
And you'll see that the business process context and why it gets so interesting is it starts in the manufacturing and something that's tangible, and then it goes to something that's in the service area or something that's digitized and not in the not as tangible. And most processes and most complexity and most companies realized, for example, that they didn't have standardization, even forgetting about trying to get the benefits of standardization in terms of automation. They realized when COVID hit and everyone had to go remote, and that's when you suddenly, that something like that'll start really exposing your lack of standardization. But I think you're about to say something, Sam, on the
Model T. Oh, yeah. I mean, I do find this fascinating because when we talk about standardizing business processes for automation and other cool things, like Jonathan's saying, the Model T and the Ford concept of the assembly line, which is really one of the first, I think, modern success stories for standardization. I'm sure people have been doing this for centuries, but that was in the early 1900s. That's not that long ago. I mean, that was like in 1913 or 1910 or somewhere around that zone. So if you think about what he did was he said, I can standardize what everyone is doing. Like I can add, everyone does a single task the same way every time, and then we can make cars much faster. We get more productivity. Because what was happening before that? Well, people ordered cars, and then you had a bunch of guys in a shop with tools and parts, and they would just make it. They would just make the car based on the order, from what I understand. So when you talk about standardizing, all of a sudden you could make cars. It was like a worldwide phenomenon. You could make them, as long as they were Model T black, you could make them like several orders of magnitude faster because there was a standard in place and everyone knew how to put the parts together and what to do and how to do it. And they were doing the same thing over and over. And that was like that was a revolution in thinking, really.
And then fast forward just a few decades later, and now we're talking about the Toyota Way.
Yep.
And
So
the next, I would say that's the next big iteration of this.
Yeah. So Toyota Way, for sure. Like now we're talking about like World War II era, 1940s. They made cars in a whole different way, but it was still standards. It was still a version of standards. They couldn't put any systems or automation or machines or like people doing the same thing over and over that made them go faster. And we won't totally derail with what is a Toyota Way and things like that. But the whole point was they were standardizing more and in more innovative ways, and that's how they improved their systems.
Well, I would say, I mean, it does pay to get into it just a little bit because the Toyota Way established all the fundamentals on how you should do standardization. So, for example, that the people doing the work are the ones that you need to engage with and the ones that have the most information on it, as opposed to it being from a top-down approach.
Yes, for sure. So Toyota, to Jonathan's point, if you're talking about how is a standard done, and again, it's funny because no one ever exposes it like that, like the art of creating standards. But Toyota had their whole process around actually going down to the floor and like looking for waste and kind of standardizing process, not standardizing roles and people. So a lot of what we were talking about with the first like Model T assembly line and sort of the Ford innovation was, let's standardize tasks and people's role to do those tasks. Whereas the Toyota model was starting to get to, let's create standard processes that we can work with so that the process is executed the same way every time. And that doesn't mean that it can't be executed by different tools and different people and different sequences, but it's really a process focus versus like a functional focus. And that might be getting into a little bit of nuance there. I don't know, Jonathan, there's a certain aspect you wanted to elaborate on, but it's kind of the thinking has been evolving, but to me, I think the important point is you have to have a standard to do anything with. And the more people were effective at documenting, executing, managing standards, the more all this innovation was able to occur in the first place.
There's a reason why I think it's important to keep going through the history a little bit, because I think it points the way toward why there's such a resistance to standardizing as the first step to then being able to achieve all the sexy things that companies are trying to do. Because, then the next step is Motorola and GE and Six Sigma. And the problem is that both Toyota and GE ended up having major problems, Toyota specifically with quality, which is where lean started. It was originally, total quality, and then it shifts, to lean. And the problem is that people associated Six Sigma and lean as being a failed process or a failed management philosophy because Toyota specifically had quality problems and because specifically GE had problems as an organization. So I think that it's important that, when you see it as, I think some people started calling it a fad, they lost that, no, lean is right. In other words, the approach to it is right. And I would posit that there's a lot of good information out there that Toyota's failure had nothing to do with their with lean not working or something like that. They had over ambitious growth targets, and GE had over ambitious buying, acquisitions that might not have been priced right. But the reason, again, and that I go through that history is because people just associate that as like something that didn't work without taking the elements of it that were fundamental and still as applicable today as they ever were.
That's certainly true. And I think a lot of methodologies get a bad rap for that when the company that was their success was built on the back of these methods, and then the company has any sort of blip in their performance or they have some massive, PR failure, it's easy to then lambast the method that they're associated with on unfounded grounds, essentially. But one thing that I think also didn't help, even outside of those companies, is everyone was trying to borrow Lean and Six Sigma to replicate the success. And that's where that really brings us up to the present, the last few decades, where people have really been dragging it through the mud, and why standards and a lot of this work, pure process improvement work, people kind of poo-poo on. It's because it didn't really make a good leap into the digital marketplace. And I think that's a big bridge in the history that is worth talking about, because if you're trying to take car manufacturing techniques and without a skilled thought process, try to bridge it into marketing agencies or digital services, legal services, financial services, it's not a one-to-one. I mean, well, here it is a one-to-one, but physically how it translates into your environment can be very non-intuitive. So people just tried, they just dipped their toes in. I'm an insurance company and I try to use Six Sigma and it wasn't working, and everyone's like, this method is stupid. It didn't really have a chance to shine in these environments because, like Jonathan said, the logic is there and the logic is proven and it's right. But a lot of it, that people wanted the process improvement, they wanted the cost reduction, they wanted the outcome, but they didn't really sit there to do the translation between one context to another. So then now a lot of people are just skipping it because they think it's a waste of time and they just want the new systems. They just want the shiny new toys.
And then you start having things like Agile, which is like we don't have to follow any steps. I don't want to say that, that's what Agile is, but essentially it shed all these constraints that people felt they were under these laborious processes. I would also say there's another issue in that the thinking that you goes into, let's say, Six Sigma is not ideal for innovation. This is what I'll posit. I don't know what you think about this, Sam. We've never spoken about this, but the reason why like startups and other entities like, fail fast and just try things and, we don't need to understand so much, replaced, I think, Lean and Six Sigma for some entities without getting the benefits of it is this failure to understand the difference between operations and projects again. And in operations, there's nothing better than these methodologies. When it comes to innovation, you could still extract value from Lean, the Lean methodology, but you probably want a different team looking at that as opposed to the same team that's grounded in Lean and trying to, have that embedded in your daily process.
Well, that's certainly true. And now you've just opened up a big can of worms, I feel like, because, from a from a problem perspective, Lean Six Sigma teams are project teams fundamentally. If they've forgotten or they don't even understand that the project ultimately has to be subject to an operation or impact an operation, which is the target of measurement for all of their data and their Lean Six Sigma processes, now we're just in a whole realm of just people milling around having literally no idea what they're doing, which is a lot of times what they are doing. And then they get kind of laughed out of the room because it's like, what are you guys doing? Like, I mean, you can have an agile project, and I think that's what you're saying, but I mean, and it can be using
yes and no.
principles.
Yes and no. Like once, let's say you've been working through Lean for a long period of time and Six Sigma, and your operations are being monitored very well, and you have continuous improvement. You're at that level of continuous improvement, and you're very agile. At that point, you're using the tenets of Lean and Six Sigma, but you're not necessarily starting a Lean and Six Sigma project. Just everyone is part of that. Like the assembly line, if suddenly there's a problem, they stop the assembly line, that's not necessarily a project at that moment. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you've really gone the whole distance of your Lean journey and your operations are at that level and you're agile, then that team, and innovation and some of the things that people are thinking about for incubator groups and the like, that could be separate. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yes. Well, and this is generally what we were saying before, which is the title Lean and Six Sigma are actually just wrap-ups. They're just like aesthetics over fundamental principles, like business science, essentially. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a project or you're doing an operation. If you're applying Lean or Six Sigma fundamentals, it doesn't mean you're using the Lean or Six Sigma branded templates to go through these heavy exercises. It means that you're internalizing the intelligence behind these methodologies and you're contextualizing that knowledge and intelligence to apply to your organization. And to your point, when you're really mature in it, honestly, the line between operations, projects, innovation, I mean, it all starts to blur together because you're just doing them all in like a rhythmic pattern. You're like seeing issues, you're calling attention to them, and then you're acting on them using best practice, logic and then principles. And that's what I think Lean and Six Sigma and all these methods are always trying to iterate toward. But like I said, we've had some pretty drastic setbacks in people's perception and understanding of how these things were applied, the history of them, and what the intention was, especially if you're talking about how they were applied in service organizations, digital organizations.
And so all that was to say, this is why I think companies skip the step and don't go through the standard of, they don't go through the process of standardization, or they think that they somehow can leapfrog past that to some new state when they can't, because they're trying to apply advanced technologies to variable processes and variable ways of doing things that ultimately won't be productive.
Exactly. So just to reiterate what Jonathan said, we took a long kind of roundabout to say that, which is that these methods, which are not really methods fundamentally, they're just logic, where people started to not like them because of repeated failure and lack of application, and now they're magnifying that sort of ignorance, I would say, by trying to just skip over them and thinking that they couldn't be done. There's nothing more, I guess, damning to show the misunderstanding of what good process work or good project work is by thinking you can just skip over standardization or removing variation or removing waste. So I did them in order. Lean is all about removing waste, and variation is a form of waste, one of the central forms of waste in lean. And when removing variation is creating standards. So again, this is where they're hidden in there. They're hidden in the logic, but it's all the same thing. Six Sigma is the same thing. Measuring a ton of data to look at the variation and remove it. It was the exact same thing that lean was trying to say, which is, again, removing unmonitored, uncontrolled variation is standardizing. So they both always start with standardize first and then move toward greater forms of process improvement. And like Jonathan said, that conversation's not even being had. People skip over it and they're like, oh, it doesn't matter what's going on in the environment. Let's just put a robot in there, or let's get the best SaaS platform and start doing the work. It's causing massive failure everywhere. These projects are not structured properly. You can't just skip the process improvement methods because you think they don't work or they're heavy. That's not how it works. That's like saying, I'm going to skip. Help me out, Jonathan. What is that like? Like we probably an amazing analogy here, right? It's like basically saying I'm going to skip putting on my pants in the morning. I don't know. Now I'm trying to. I can't pull it out of nowhere. But you can't skip fundamental steps just because you don't like them or find them tedious.
I'm gonna skip having a good diet and exercising and get the benefits of having a great body.
Yes, yeah, that's a good one too. I'm gonna wear these amazing shoes and run the marathon and get an amazing time because of the
sorry,
new
yeah, that's
shoes.
even better. Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not gonna do anything in between that one would normally have to actually address the process. Yeah, I mean, like these things don't work. There's no instant fix. There's no skipping to the end or skipping. You can't not pass go. Which is why, again, if the point that we're trying to bring into this podcast is, if you want the new system, if you want to make any changes really to your organization, it has to come from a place of standards. Because if not everything is the same, or you don't know what's going on, there's also variation, you're not going to be able to change anything. There's no baseline that you can control. That's the narrative here. So if you notice your organization is doing this, again, you got to be in the know about what's happening. But the point is, you can't have 10 people doing everything slightly different and then expect them to be given a command and all of them to do the new thing and line up into doing the new thing. That's called changing multiple dimensions at one time, which is why if you skip that first step of getting everyone lined up, you're gonna have a hell of a time getting them into a new system or doing anything, like getting them to do anything.
But let's take RPA as an example. So company says, oh, RPAs, everyone's doing RPAs. We need to do RPAs.
Robotic process automation.
So, sorry, why don't you go through what that is, and because it's
so RPA is this new trendy thing that is basically saying, well, this process could be done a lot cheaper if we automated it and then had the robots do it. So like automation through robotics, robotic process automation, which don't even get me started on all those buzzwords, but yeah, I mean, that's what people want. They want the robots to do things because robots don't tire and they're pennies on the dollar. So go ahead.
There are many instances, where people are just entering information from one spreadsheet to another spreadsheet. So an RPA can go ahead and take, can automate that process and take the human out of it. The problem is that you're skipping through all the steps that Lean would tell you to do. You skipped optimization, you skipped understanding the as is, and skipped optimization, and you might be embedding a bad process. So you might have RPA success, you got the solution, that the executive told you need to implement, but it's not making you any more efficient. It's not giving you any actual benefit, or it might be, but now it's consistently going to keep a bad process in your environment.
But to be honest, that's the best case scenario, that you turn on your robot and the robot can actually still do work. It's just not doing it in an optimized way. Most of the time, people can turn on the robot and the process breaks entirely. You're skipping that reality where, because you didn't standardize and you took 10 people's jobs and now you have a single robot doing all 10 of them in one way, you've officially probably broken, if you didn't make sure everyone was doing it the same way, a bunch of institutional knowledge. You've now just broken a bunch of the strength of one process over another. You didn't assimilate a best practice before you even tried to make the robot do it. So there's like the aspect that Jonathan's talking about where the robot could now be, you've automated to a bad process. or you've automated to a process that fundamentally just won't work because you didn't have a standard. You didn't really know what your as is was. You didn't really control for the fact that the process needs to have continuity in one solution to another.
And even if you hit the best case scenario and the RPA helps you, there's a good chance it's going to fail because you didn't understand exactly what your process was and how often it's happening. And RPAs always need a baseline that it's going to be reliably the same process over time, because as it changes, you break the RPA. So.
And that's where if you don't have a documented standard, again, that shows you how the process should be working and what should be going on, you're always going to be scrambling. And just even put RPA aside, people want robots, people want automation, people want new systems. I'm not going to spend a lot of time saying how all those are related or they're sort of distinct definitions, but people want it faster. They want it done cheaper. They want it done by technology because that's the way the world is going. And that's not a bad instinct. But if you don't have a process that's going into the technology, that's written down, standard, documented, well established, validated by the people who are doing it today in a live environment, it's just a recipe for disaster. And if you're part of a project or you're being asked to do these things and you don't know what the process is you're trying to configure or code or put into a new system or a new solution, this is a giant red flag. This cannot be done without the standards work being done first. I actually have been on clients just recently in the last few months that it was this constant conversation of, okay, we really need a new system here. And then my first question is, okay, well, what are you guys doing today? Well, we don't need to know what we're doing today. I don't have it written down anywhere, but like the new system will help us. Help you do what? If you don't know what you're doing, then how is the system going to help you do it? Fundamentally, that's the conversation, but people just, I don't know. I will say it just like that to people's faces, and it's hard to click because nobody wants to even contemplate what the standards work actually looks like, which is just really everyone sitting in a room and agreeing that this is the way that this is going to be done or should be done. So it's just it's a mess.
And then bring it back to the efficiency, the famous Bill Gates quote of automation applied to an inefficient process only magnifies the inefficiency. Automation applied to an efficient process will magnify the efficiency. So you definitely can't skip the first step and suddenly think that the automation is going to do anything for you.
Yeah, and here's a little bit of corporate therapy for me personally, where I'll vent on this, which is you think that doing the standards work, again, it's the non-sexy part. It's like we want to do a system upgrade. And my response to you is, okay, well, let's sit down and map out the process and make sure everyone's aligned on what it is before we move it over to a system. And that's the last thing anybody wants to hear. But I'm going to tell you right now, from my experience doing this over and over again in various ways, you are going to not get the lift that you want. So even if you think that you're the 500th company in the last week that thinks they can skip the standards part and get the results that they're looking for by just moving directly into the system and ignoring the fact that you don't have a standard best practice, you're going to eat more cost. It's going to cost you more and it's not going to work. I mean, that's just the universal truth. So that's a little bit me just expressing myself. But I mean, I want to do it for people's own benefit though. It's hard work, but you can't skip the steps. It's not going to help you.
Yeah, I mean, and this brings back all the old, the every podcast we've done back to even solution monomania and, people just getting fixated on implementing or adopting, the latest and greatest technology without the fundamentals. You will never achieve the benefits that you think you will.
Yeah. And that's the thing I think people with maybe tying back some of the standard topic from this podcast and the last one on standards being a solution, it's a paired solution. Let's start thinking about it that way. Let's start socializing that, which is if you want technology, if you want to digitize, that means putting a manual process into a digital process or a digital tool or whatever. The project could be to get the system put in place, to upgrade a system, to get a new system, but the paired project always has to be standards first. That's the right time to do a standards project, which is if you're going to make any suggestions, say, I think this project, which is really sexy and great, which is getting this brand new world-class system, should be paired with a project that looks at best practice and looks at standardizing the process that's going to go into the system first. And those are kind of sister projects. You could also have a standards project that's standalone. I think a lot of businesses, that's what pure process improvement is, and that's what Jonathan and I are saying nobody likes to do anymore because people are not very good at it. It's very complicated, especially for digital environments. But you can also just reduce variation and reduce costs with a pure standards project. But especially you have to do it if you're going to try to move that data into a new tool or a robot, especially if you're doing RPA stuff or you're automating whatever that means to you, like that loose container of automation. So it's one of those things that let's champion the standards project in the right place and in the right time. I think that's one of my rallying cries, which is because it's so important.
It's championing the standards and championing the fact that it's a project, because when we're talking about digitization and automation, and we're getting into workflow and other higher level combination of standards that is required to be able to achieve those technologies, you're getting to transformative level change. So everything that we talked about in terms of the complexity and challenge of implementing a standard is now magnified much more. In fact, it could be a whole program of projects. So
well, that's another point that I'd like to add to that one, which is actually it is most of the time the problem. So even the reason, so people want technology, they want digitization, they want automation because they think that's the solution to their problem. But the problem itself is that there's no standard. The problem itself that everyone's doing it differently, no one knows how it's done, and because of that, there can't be a best practice by definition. A best practice means that everyone is following a standard that has been identified as the best practice, which is the most efficient, the most productive, what have you. And I'd say most organizations, even if you put your technology roadmap, that's another great word, and you just delay that by 6 months and just did pure standards work and just standardize processes across the organization, you would get a huge lift and you would solve actually a lot of your actual problems, which is just uncontrollable variation in your process, not knowing what's going on, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, that's another big one. But again, that people don't like that.
Most of the time, if you're just doing pure process improvement and actually want to achieve efficiency and reduce cost, half the time in looking at a particular process in a particular team, I would generally end up reducing the technology that they're relying on in favor of simpler technology because it's more applicable to the business objective. So rather than trying to take a square, put a circle into it or whatever the term
circle
is.
Into a square hole.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times you might want to take a step back because the technology or the attempt to implement technology got far ahead of any business benefit that could be leveraged from that technology.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other dimension, right tool for right process. I mean, it really points to, I think, what you've seen and I've seen too, which is a lot of people, they get the next best technology and it's a total fail, like a total cluster F. It's like nothing works, nothing gets the results. And then their solution is buying another technology to put on top of it because somebody else sold them another technology to bolt on or replace that one. And then it's just, I mean, that's the definition of just you're digitizing nonsensically. I mean, people are putting one tech on top of another tech, and then all of a sudden they have this monolithic, crazy tech stack that can't be configured, doesn't work with each other, won't be supported. I mean, how many businesses have we gone into just in the last few years that have that problem? Like they don't even know how to roll that all back. And like you said, I think it's not even saying that, okay, we need a simpler technical tool. It's that you just need the right amount of tools for the right amount of process that you have. You need to consolidate to the least amount of technology possible to meet your objectives, because just creating a Rubes Ginsburg machine where it's just a bunch of like levers and pulleys that are just moving like a piece of toast around, it's not, you don't get any benefit from that.
But there does seem to be a lot of activity happening, and there does seem to be a lot of technology flowing around, and so people are happy, but it has nothing to do with what the real objectives of digitization are. And it might be a good time, Sam, just to put in your definition of automation. I think it's a nice standard for people.
Yeah. So automation, there's a lot of confusion in this space. So when you're digitizing, well, let me start with, we'll talk about it for a second. Digitizing really, in our definition, is taking a process that is being done in a manual environment and moving it into a digital or a technological environment, a system environment. And that is different from automation, which by our account is taking a process and transitioning it successfully to a lower cost resource executing the same process. And a lower cost resource can be technology, which is always everyone's goal when they think automation, because technology is a very low cost resource. But it also could be taking it from an executive and moving it over to an outsource partner in a foreign country. It could be just moving it from, let's say, an executive down to a junior manager. Anytime you can take a process that's at a higher cost because of its, the resources needed to execute it, and you're restructuring it so it moves down to lower cost configurations with lower cost resources, and it works the same with the same output, you're automating. You're successfully automating. So, it's a broader definition than I think most people are working with, but I think it's one that will help you keep things straight. Because if somebody's saying we need to reduce costs through automation, moving process from one resource to another is standards work, I guess, to pull it all back together. You're just writing down what needs to be done in a consistent enough way where a lower cost resource, a less experienced resource, a technology resource can execute the same process. And now we're coming all back around, because in order to automate properly, it's not about picking the right tool. It's about describing the process correctly. That's the insight.
So it's always optimization, standardization, then automation.
Standardization, then optimization.
Right. Standardization, yeah.
Standardization, then optimization, then automation.
But you never skip that. You can never skip that and go straight to automation, then, because then it's either not going to succeed or it's highly costly.
Well, what happens is standardization, optimization, automation. If you start at automation, standardization, optimization happen anyway. It's just you don't control them anymore. Wherever your process is gets dragged through those stages, and whatever happens as a result is the new standard and is the new optimized process, which could be bad on both counts.
Right, but it tends to also result in high number of customizations in standard technology. So you automate, but it's not sustainable.
Yes. Well, and that's a whole, and again, and maybe that can be our next topic for next week. I mean, automation is such a hot button topic right now, and everyone wants it. It is good. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's not good. It's great. It's the objective of all process work, in my opinion. And like we just said, I mean, the entire world evolves on the premise of we can consolidate knowledge into standard formats so that it can be executed upon by wider groups of resources. If you want to think about it that way, that's sort of the heart of automation work. So I think automation is sort of the description of the future, and technology has allowed automation at unprecedented rates, but not without standardization. So I think automation is a fascinating topic, and maybe that's a good topic for next week.
That's a good note for me, Sam.
Sounds good. So I guess as we pondered about standards for about 2 weeks now, we'll leave it at that. And we hope everyone is enjoying business therapy as far as that goes. So don't forget to leave us comments and engage with us. And otherwise, we will talk to you next week.